Okay, well, since we have a couple preliminaries, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome. The very first thing I want to say is that if we have any technical difficulties in continuing the panel today, give us a few minutes, try to jump back on. If we can't resolve it quickly, we will reschedule or share a recording. And so far, this hasn't happened, but someday it might. That said, I'm Walter Sterling, for those of you who don't know, the Dean of St. John's College in Santa Fe, and I want to welcome all the folks that are joining us for today's event, which is part of our annual Dean's Lecture and Concert Series. And this is one of the contexts in which we're experimenting a little bit. We've done plenty of things like this before, but enjoying taking advantage of this format to vary things a little bit from our normal lectures. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our tutor panel on photography with tutors David Carl, David McDonald, and Krishnan Venkatesh. We have a tradition at St. John's College of not introducing our own, as we say. If you attend a lecture in the Great Hall, one of our tutors just walks up and begins. But in this context where we do have more visitors and guests and folks from both campuses, I don't want to give anyone the introduction they deserve, but I do want to recognize who we have. And it's interesting to me, Mr. Carl, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Venkatesh, all longtime tutors on the Santa Fe campus. Mr. McDonald, like I, a graduate of the college as well. And interestingly, all three of our panelists today have served as the associate dean, or what we used to call the director. Now the associate dean for graduate programs, used to be the director of the Graduate Institute. And it might say something that three such folks are the ones leading our discussion on photography today. And this is the fruit of a year-long faculty study group last academic year, which Mr. Carl led, and it was a very welcome group for our faculty to explore photography, both the images and writing on aesthetics and so on. So thank you all. What we're going to do is hear from each of the panelists, maybe 15 to 20 minutes each. So the whole talk will take between 45 minutes and an hour. And when we conclude, let's say around 5:30, we'll take a very short, just two-minute break, and then we'll come back for conversation. We'll immediately open it up to the audience, and there'll be a variety of ways you can ask questions, either make comments, either live voice or in writing, and I'll go over those when we start. So I think without further ado, I am going to hand the baton to Mr. Carl, who's going to begin, followed by Mr. McDonald and then Mr. Venkatesh. They will be sharing images at times, so I know sometimes folks are calling in, but if at all possible, you should try to have your video up and running so you can see the images that they're referring to. Mr. Carl.
Thank you. Sterling, I was muted. Let me start again. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I want to say a few general things about aesthetics and aesthetic education, and then turn to the consideration of two particular photographs, which, if technology cooperates, I'll be sharing my screen with you in a few minutes. Under the qualitative criteria for the evaluation of tutors, the St. John's College Tutor Handbook lists as its first criterion excellence of intellect and imagination. I admit that as a tutor specifically, and as an educator more generally, I've given a lot of thought to questions: what constitutes excellence of intellect and imagination, and how can we go about deliberately cultivating such excellence within ourselves and others? Every St. John's freshman knows, when they first begin to grapple with the challenges of translating ancient Greek, that a good translation is the result of both intellect and imagination. requiring a rigorous understanding of Greek grammar, syntax, morphology, and vocabulary, as well as something like a more artistic feel for the right word or phrase. Whether we are learning how to see a plant in freshman lab, demonstrate a proposition from Euclid, render a line of Sappho from the original in contemporary English, we are exercising both our intellectual and our imaginative faculties. Nevertheless, over the past 20 years of my work as a tutor, I've often had the feeling that at college we're more comfortable with the challenges of cultivating the intellectual faculties than we are those of the imagination. There's something vaguely ineffable about the imagination that defies algorithms or formulas. We're searching for just the right word or phrase when writing or translating a poem, or just the right note or length of silence when composing a piece of music. Grammar, morphology, mathematics, biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy are bodies of knowledge governed by rules and laws that we can learn and master as means of cultivating our intellectual faculties. But how do we go about similarly developing the imagination? I want to speak today about photography as a form of aesthetic education, and about aesthetic education as a way of developing the imagination, a way of learning how to see and experience the world around us more deeply, more sensitively, and more perceptively than we might otherwise. I also want to mention in passing that since time is short, I'm going to make several rather bold assertions about the importance of art, aesthetics, and photography over the next few minutes without taking the time to provide rigorous evidence in support of these claims. In what follows, I'm going to move quickly, somewhat abruptly. You are, of course, free to take me to task for any of these claims during question period. My argument, but perhaps illustration would be a better word, is that studying individual artworks closely, learning how to see them, and more importantly, learning from them how to see, is one of the means by which we can deliberately cultivate our imaginative faculties. And that the study of photography in particular can constitute a kind of education in seeing, by means of which we become more sensitive to and perceptive of the world around us and of ourselves within that world. Aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that deals with questions related to art and beauty, including questions such as taste and judgment as they relate to works of art. A question about the quality of a novel, such as, is this a great book? And if so, why? Is an aesthetic question, which is why, although in professional philosophy departments, aesthetics, like Bacchus, is often dismissed as a minor auxiliary deity, in a community like St. John's, it soon reveals itself as both the oldest and the most powerful of the philosophic gods. For aesthetics deals with the very most important questions of value, judgment, interpretation, and meaning. Etymologically, the English word aesthetics is derived from the Greek aesthestai, verb to perceive. Perception, which in the Western tradition is closely tied to seeing as both a physical act and a metaphor for knowing and understanding, as in such phrases as, yes, I see what you mean, makes photography, from the Greek phos, like in graphos, writing, a particularly rich art form to consider in light of the question of aesthetic education. Before photography, fine art was divided into 5 distinct categories. Architecture, which Hegel says is the form art took during the symbolic period of humankind's development. Sculpture, which typified the classical periods of Greece and Rome. And then painting, music, and poetry, which rose to eminence during the so-called modern or romantic period of human development, at least in the West. And then along came photography sometime in the second half of the 19th century. The technical and scientific discoveries which led to a new art form opened the way for what are arguably the most radical developments in art and aesthetics over the course of human history. So many of the new art forms of the past century, from cinema to installation art, video game to virtual reality, would not have been possible without the technical innovations which gave rise to photography. In our image-saturated 21st century, thoughtful study of photography is more important and more urgent than ever. At St. John's, we are first and foremost concerned with books, and in particular, with great books. But in the world that surrounds the college, the image threatens to overwhelm the word. And for those of us who continue to care about the role and importance of the word in today's world, an understanding of the image is essential. Photographs are used to educate and stimulate, but also to manipulate and control by playing on our fears and desires. Photography can either promote or short-circuit the rational faculties. As Montaigne said about wine, only good things can be abused. His observation is equally true about photography. Over half a century ago, American photographer Berenice Abbott remarked that, quote, "The world today has been conditioned overwhelmingly to visualize. The picture has almost replaced the word as a means of communication," end quote. This is even more true today than it was in the 1950s, and Walter Benjamin's observation that, quote, "It is not the person ignorant of writing, but the one ignorant of photography who will be the illiterate of the future," end quote, sounds a more urgent call to action than ever before. If we are going to remain literate in this world of images and find ways to ensure the relevancy of the books we care so much about, we must also develop literacy across these different mediums of communication, expression, manipulation, and control. The study of photography provides us with the occasion to ask, what is at stake in seeing and in learning how to see better? What are the elements of better seeing, and what distinguishes good seeing from bad seeing? How do we learn to look? These are all questions of aesthetics. At St. John's, we strive to become better readers, better thinkers, better listeners. Can the program also support our efforts to become better seers? And can we while we're at it, come to understand more rigorously what we mean by better and how we distinguish one work of art, a book, a poem, a novel, a movie, a song, a photograph, as better than another? In other words, might the study of photography paradoxically help us understand what we mean when we talk about great books, and how and why we distinguish such books from others? In terms of the importance of aesthetics, one might argue along the line of Schiller's critique of Kant in his letters on aesthetic education, which was to have a profound influence on the aesthetic philosophies of Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. Deepening our understanding of artworks encourage us to cultivate what is highest and best in our nature, whereas political science prepares us to articulate viable responses to what is lowest and base in our nature. Aesthetics, which is the branch of philosophy which seeks to unify reason with imagination and creativity with intellect, also seeks to help man cultivate and improve those human aspirations free from the practical and utilitarian. And while some people speak of art as pragmatically useless, others see in it the highest manifestation of humanity's greatest ambitions and aspirations, those ends which seek to leave the merely practical and utilitarian behind, so that, unlike politics, which is concerned with necessary evil, art is concerned with an unnecessary good. And aesthetics is the branch of philosophy intent on helping us to experience and understand that good. From a so-called pragmatic point of view, it's an all too real question whether any ethical or moral philosophy has ever made anyone a virtuous person, or whether any social or political philosophy has ever helped produce a just society. No metaphysical system has ever solved the mysteries of being, nor has any theology answered our questions about the divine. But aesthetics really can help us engage more deeply with great works of art. Art is an expression of man's highest aspirations, rather than his most pragmatic ones. No doubt a fully human life would be impossible without political order, but it would be worthless without aesthetic aspiration. This is perhaps why 19th century German philosophy idealized the cultural achievements of ancient Greece, why Pericles' Athens was long considered the apex of Western civilization, and why Schiller, in his aforementioned letters, famously remarked, quote, "If we are to solve political problems in practice, we must follow the path of aesthetics, since it is through beauty that we arrive at freedom," end quote. From the architecture, sculpture, and tragic poetry of Athens to the art of photography is a journey of some 2,000 years. Along the way, the advent of photography, both a science and an art, has led to a radical reconsideration of some of the fundamental questions of philosophical aesthetics. Philosophers of aesthetics in the 18th and first half of the 19th centuries concerned themselves with questions of beauty, taste, judgment, and quality, but never had to stop and ask themselves whether or not they knew what a work of art was, or what counted as a work of art. One might deliberate between the qualities that distinguished a good work from a bad one, but the question, what is art, did not constitute one of the canonical questions of traditional aesthetics. By the late 19th century, this question came to dominate philosophical aesthetics, in no small part due to the difficulties which photography and other technological innovations that became part of the production of works of art, such as recorded music and movies, presented to the previously unproblematic category known as art. Today, we are as perplexed as ever by questions of taste and quality, and we struggle, as we always have, to make value distinctions between different works. But now we must also pause to ask ourselves how we know whether a given object, an act or performance or experience, or even a thought or idea, as in the case of concept art, is a work of art or not. These conundrums are part of the legacy of photography's influence on the art world and aesthetics. Any possible answer to such questions cannot be found by means of theoretical considerations alone, but must be sought through encounters with the works themselves. Great artworks always exceed any theory in criticism about them. Yet these modes of critical discourse, properly understood, can help challenge and expand our receptivity to the work, and thus also expand personal taste and the inevitable limits such taste places on us. One of the primary goals of aesthetic education is to help us think about the role that personal taste plays in our response to works of art, to help us see beyond the narrow sphere of what we like or dislike in order to engage with the work on its terms, rather than limited by our own. With this in mind, I'd like to turn now to a brief consideration of two particular photographs, with the question not so much, how do we learn to see them, but rather how can they learn to teach us, or how can they teach us to see? The first work I want to talk about is Hungarian-American photographer Andrei Kertész's 1928 picture, La Fourchette. As you can see, it's a fork propped against a bowl, and of the shadow of two of them cast on the table upon which they rest. Only a portion of the bowl is visible, the rest of it cut off by the lower right corner. The handle end of the fork disappears into the lower left corner of the frame. The center of the frame is the shadow of the lower half of the fork's tines, blending together with the shadow of the bowl. The upper half of the shadow curves into the bowl itself, as if the liquid were slowly dripping over its rim. The surfaces in the photograph are particularly striking. The light that plays unevenly along the back of the fork gives its metal the same precious shine we see in images of the gold death masks of Mycenae, but in a far more quotidian object. The light transforms the fork, or perhaps simply reveals what has always been true about it, that by virtue of the rich luster of its metal and the sensuous curve of the handle that flows seamlessly into four separate tines, this commonplace object is revealed as beautiful and mysterious. One wonders if this beauty has always been present, only we never noticed it before, or whether by virtue of the power of the photograph, a new beauty has been created in the object. Supporting this somehow new but still familiar fork, the bowl is spotless. There is no evidence of a meal, as if eating were no longer what these objects were for. The frame is divided asymmetrically and diagonally, so that the balance of the fork is mirrored in the balanced composition of the photograph itself. Its harmony with the bowl suggests a deliberately crafted sculpture, more than a pair of kitchen items typically used to eat with. Who would put an object like this in their mouth? It looks too dangerous and too precious. The edges of the shadows are perfectly sharp. The rounded edge of the bowl shadows look like an eclipse that is consuming the fork. The rough edge of the bowl shadow, the rough edge of the bowl shadow looks like an eclipse that is consuming the fork. The slightly marbled surface of the table emphasizes the smooth metal of the fork. The bowl's rim is slightly rough, its interior smooth and clean, and extends towards the edge of the frame of a perfectly illuminated white that intensifies the black shadow below. Here, the shadow of the fork is no less real than the fork itself. Just as the photograph of the fork is no less real than the object so carefully placed in a gentle balance of light and composition. There is only one object in the image, a table fork shadow bowl. Kertesz's photo is simultaneously a photo of a fork propped against the bowl and not a photo of these two items, because by virtue of the photo, these items cease to be merely a bowl and a fork. By training our attention on two everyday objects in an aesthetic context, Kertesz not only raises the question of what is art and why should a picture of a fork be an example of art, but he also leads us to reconsider the commonplace items of our everyday world. By virtue of the photograph, the act of seeing is renewed. Forks, seen as we have never seen forks before, and new possibilities for the everyday objects around us rise up. Shelley describes this phenomena in his defense of poetry when he writes, quote, "Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar." In this sense, Kertesz's picture is a kind of poetry. Next photo, last photo. Continuing in the vein of photography's power to lift the veil and reveal to us the beauty of commonplace objects, Manuel Alvarez Bravo's 1977 Carrizo y Tele helps us think about the collision of nature and technology. In this photo, natural and man-made objects send their tendrils out into the world, jointly reaching into it to ensnare or embrace. The tendrils of the reed seem to reach out towards the Tele antenna as Adam's hand stretches towards God in Michelangelo's painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The tendrils of a human construct grow alongside those of the natural world, raising questions about the relationship between them. Human beings change the world we live in more than any other living creature, turning the natural world into the human world. Photography is a peculiar record of the uneasy balance between these different worlds. Carrizo y Tele is mostly empty space, sky. But this space acts the way silence is between the notes in a piece of music act, to give the images which occupy the non-empty space in the picture a heightened sense of presence. The form of the reed's long claw-like leaves seems to clutch at the sky. A fluidly jagged, twisting set of irregular curves and angles dominate the left foreground of frame in order to set off the thin-line triangular geometric regularity of the antenna in the right background. Both of these shapes, offered up here as representatives of natural and the civilized, are set off by two dark triangles, perhaps portions of roofs of neighboring houses that barely puncture the two lower corners of the frame. The left one has two short lines that jut into the sky, complementing the linear delicacy of the antenna while overlapping with a single frond from the sprawling reed. One thinks of the drooping claws of a plant-like vampire alongside the sleek aesthetic sparseness of a robot. One thinks of the wild and the tamed and taming, for the antenna is not just a sign of human, as opposed to natural regularity of shape and form. It is also a sign of what it does. What is the antenna a symbol of? We live in houses and not under the open sky. That we watch stories about the lives of others as a way of understanding or maybe distracting ourselves from our own lives. Is all this really contained within the tension between the wild, threatening curves of the organic and the rigid lines and sharp angles of the man-made? How much of what I've been saying is actually in the photo itself? And how much of it do we read into these works by virtue of the hermeneutic acts of looking, which photography itself teaches us how to perform? I want to suggest that these two photos and innumerable others constitute local occasions for the kinds of lessons in seeing that are an essential part of aesthetic education. And that aesthetic education, in turn, is an essential part of our efforts to cultivate the imagination, to develop that excellence of imagination, which is an essential part of our work at the college, as well as of our being in the world. The work we do at the college helps us to read better, think better, talk better, and listen better. It can also help us not only to see better, but to reflect on one of the essential questions of aesthetics. What do we mean by the value judgment better? How do we distinguish whether considering a work of art or an action in our own lives, the better from the worst in the first place. Thank you. Mr. McDonald, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to pursue a few questions today connected to photography as imitation or mimesis, and some questions about the place of photography as art. And I think much of what I'll say is going to intersect with things that Mr. Carl has said. To get situated, I'm going to speak first briefly about art photography. Much of the discourse on photography with which I grew up was about the struggle of photography to be regarded as an art, a fine art. I'm most familiar with the way that Edward Weston, Brett Weston, Ansel Adams, and their colleagues in the first half of the 20th century worked toward this goal of establishing art photography. I grew up admiring images from this group of mostly West Coast photographers, and I took seriously the idea of art photography. But these days, the distinction between image making as a day-to-day activity and image making as an art seems unclear. And the meaning of fine art as a category seems obscure. In part, the ubiquity of images and the ease of making images now, when nearly all of us have a camera in our pocket, muddles such categories. And culture has become so multifarious that the high culture of the mid-20th century can seem now just another strand amid a vast and burgeoning array of cultural productions. We are in an age of cultural pluralism. So though Ansel Adams and his friends tried to gain for photography the dignity of painting, now we all drink from the fire hose of contemporary culture in which distinctions of genres and of high and low seem neither urgent nor easy to make. This situation of the culture is a pivotal issue, not just for photography, but also for the whole realm of aesthetic and intellectual endeavor. I'm going to turn now to mimesis. The question of the status of art photography and fine arts will return naturally along the way. What mimesis means roughly is imitation. The ancients in the Western tradition seem to have thought of art as primarily imitative. When you make a sculpture or a painting or a poem, you are imitating objects or actions so as to make a representation. You're trying to show something true about what is available in principle to everyone, and it's not really about you, it's about realities beyond you. The idea of art as being primarily expressive and personal comes much later, art as the effort to bring one's own feelings, views, or sensibility out of a private self and into a public space. In any case, with regard to the impersonal imitative effort, Plato seems to have taken a dim view, since the world is for him already derivative of some original that's not available in the realm of appearances. What good are imitations of imitations, especially when they could rouse harmful passions or divert us from the truth of things? Aristotle seems less wary of mimetic activity inasmuch as he sees poetry as serving a function, for example, in his famous account of the cathartic effect of tragedy. So that's older views of mimesis in a nutshell. In photography, the mimetic power is immense, and it doesn't require years of practice in drawing or painting to accomplish. It is automated. I do not need to be concerned with paint and brush strokes. I need only press a button. This is especially the case now, but was largely true even in the era when only film photography existed. I may need to labor in setting the correct exposure and focus, and I may need to spend much time in the darkroom, but the primary elements of the rendering are accomplished without my needing to make the myriad of small movements and judgments entailed in creating a painting. I can easily get an image that looks like the world, looks more like the world in a way than does any painting. In journalistic photography and commercial photography, we're primarily seeking to document what we see. And this documentary image might then be used to inform or to sell a product. And in some ways, the documentary use of photography is the most obvious use. So what's going on when I make a photograph which I do not intend to be simply a documentary image? The boundaries here are not clear, since there are some wonderful images which serve both a documentary function and are regarded as art. Some famous images by Dorothea Lange, for example. But in general, art photography as a genre depends on an intention to do something besides simply recording the visual world, just recording the optical thing that's going on. Art photography means to do more. Snapshots, the pictures we take of our family and friends or of a view while traveling, are a helpful thing to consider here. We make these images because we wish to remember or capture both the thing seen and the particular atmosphere of feeling that belongs to it for us. We are delighted, for example, to take a picture which represents a characteristic expression of someone we love, or which somehow preserves for us the special exhilaration of being at a particular place. When we take a photo of a friend, it is to some extent a record of a whole world of feeling and a certain communion of oneself with another self, or participation with the wholeness in which both selves live. It's not always this way, of course, but the photos we end up treasuring have this quality. If we do end up showing such a photo to someone not already part of the world of that image, we do so as if to say, look, here's what my world feels like to me. Here's what I care about. Here's what matters to me. So far, this sounds very much like the expressivist tendency of most modern cultural production. But it's worth asking, how did the photo become endowed with a non-documentary power, something beyond a rendering simply of a person standing in front of a tree? It became, at least for me, as a picture taker, not just a record of objects in space and time, but a glimpse into a whole way of apprehending what I love. And to whatever extent a stranger might see in it something of what I see beyond the documenting of plain visual experience, I'm on the road toward photography as an art. That is, when it ceases to be merely personal, but somehow to be simultaneously personal and transpersonal, then I'm no longer just taking snapshots. So imagine directing an affectionate way of seeing to a world beyond what is already familiar to you, beyond the obvious objects of your affection. Now you're looking beyond the subject of snapshots into a larger world. Inasmuch as you have a regard for what you see, it enters into your unified seeing, becomes part of your coherent, larger vision of things. Inasmuch as it is not familiar, it will be full of surprises. And just as in the best circumstance of taking snapshots, you feel united with what you see, you find yourself taken up in a happy coincidence of seer and seen, so art photography possesses the affective unity, the affective unity of the best snapshots, but with a sensibility enlarged enough to encompass a world of experience and to convey to others that view, which is not merely optical. We're now considering a kind of picture taking in which there's a mimesis of the things seen, optical mimesis, you might say, but also a conveying of aspects of experience and sensibility which are not simply optical. So the question is, how does this happen? If we can get some grasp of this, we'll have a way of talking about art photography where art photography encompasses optical mimesis and mimesis of the unseen. Here, personal expressivity and a way of seeing that goes beyond the personal can coincide. I'm going to approach this from 2 points of view. One, the experience of taking pictures. The other, the experience of looking at pictures. So on the one hand, how as a photographer, your distinctive way of regarding things gets into your pictures? And on the other hand, how as viewers of photographs, we get to see a sense of how the photographer sees and what matters about that scene. When you take a picture, you're choosing where to point the camera, what to include in the frame. In doing so, you're saying to yourself, here's something worth seeing. That selectivity comprehends something of what matters to you, what you find beautiful, what moves you, what seems essential. The experience is one of recognition and discovery at the same time. If you've practiced, you may even anticipate precisely the quality and look and atmosphere of the finished image, and that anticipation is part of the feeling of that initial capture. You experience recognition in as much as you're following through on a sense of the world you've already developed, and here and there you spot instances of it and take a picture. You experience discovery in as much as the world keeps challenging and surprising you, saying, here's something you don't yet know was a source of delight and wonder. In that, you extend your sensibility. And what do I mean by sensibility? The term has a long heritage that I can't give an account of here and seems to have fallen out of fashion, perhaps because it has romantic associations and means nothing in the realm of quantification and economic value. I would say that sensibility is a cultivated and coherent way of experiencing the world, which is continuous with a feeling for the dignity and meaning of experience. Its unity is not on the level of doctrine or opinions or claims, but is the unity of a heart and mind which apprehends the world and belongs to that world. A world is by its nature unified. Things arbitrarily assembled do not constitute a world. And we have the word world, we have cosmos, universe, all of them necessarily intend a unity. And to belong to a world is to feel some love to it, some love for it, to care for it. One of the misfortunes of our time is that many of us, though worldly, do not have a world. In my view, part of what artistic practice could do for us is to help us recover a world. So the picture taker has seen something worth seeing, has had a glimpse into a larger unity. That's a felt unity rather than a posited unity. To whatever extent the image has compositional excellence and coherence, visual patterning and beauty, these are correlates of the apprehended unity. These things all go along with perceiving a world which holds together. These are the signs and tokens of worldness. To return to one of our questions, how did something beyond mere optical mimesis occur in the art of picture taking? The beauty of its image, its order, its coherence, and the particular sense of what matters conveyed in the selectivity of the seeing, these together convey something beyond the mere mechanical imaging of things. The image had that mechanical mimesis, but it also was mimetic of a larger felt coherence and sense of meaning. That is the higher mimesis of any art, not just photography. Let's shift now to the other point of view, that of looking at pictures. What might it do for us to look at pictures? In looking at pictures from a good photographer, you apprentice yourself to a sensibility and thereby deepen and develop your own. This may enlarge your ability to be happy, in that you might learn to more fully inhabit a world, a universe of people and things that holds together, perhaps a universe with meaning. As I've suggested, the primary mode of world is affective, so no amount of insistence on principles can get you there. You have to learn to behold a world. And lurking behind much of my talk so far has been an implicit ethical claim. To regard the world in a certain way, or to show that the world is worth regarding, is to have an ethical disposition toward it. Let me return to the notion of things holding together. Much of contemporary experience, especially among those who inhabit a globalized, commercialized, and commodified sphere, has a feeling of isolation and fragmentation. When I look at images on Instagram, this is often what I see. Not a world, not a range of plausible worlds, but instead individuals concerned with documenting the one thing whose reality and importance they can corroborate, themselves. These images of selves tend to bear stylized expressions, simultaneously blank and artificial, mimetic of other blank and artificial expressions, and no longer seeming to engage primary human experience. To the extent that there are pictures of places, landscapes, sunsets, buildings, actions, these too are derivative views, received ways of looking, formulaic. It is as if each of us wants to put forward the picture of ourselves in which no distinction and no development of personhood is discernible. Everything is polished, filtered. One does not see the startling depth of a human being or of a world. I point these things out only in order to argue that to be trapped in such a mimetic loop is a way of having no world. It is a way of missing out on the richness, fullness, and astonishment of apprehending and engaging a world. And to whatever extent we identify with our representations, our sense of ourselves becomes narrow and impoverished. One more remark about selfies, images in which the picture taker directs the camera toward themselves. There is a rich tradition of self-portraiture in painting and in photography. Such portraits can convey great depth, a sense of the complexity and challenge and joy of being a person. They can reveal a great deal about the human experience and about the particular person in the picture. But in much current practice, it amounts to an endorsement of an atomized individuality in which the person pictured is the world. And the primary reference to other beings is through mimesis playing out in the person of the picture taker. The person in the picture strives to look like other pictured persons, imitation of an imitation. A similar derivative cycle is present in much of what's called the fine arts. Rather than trying to convey the world, a world, anything primary, many fine art pieces reference other pieces in the same genre, and by doing so mark themselves as fine art. Such pieces can command a high price and have their own commercial industry surrounding them. They do not come to grips with the human experience in an honest and visionary way. The term fine art was meant some time ago to apply to the works which do try to show something about the human experience, do show some understanding or vision with regard to being human. That required an honest engagement with experience, an honest reckoning with what it's like to be human and have a world, and an honest effort to render all this with fidelity. Existing works of art can help with that effort. At the very least, they can inspire and guide us and strengthen our vision of our world. So they are not at odds with experience, rather they are part of it. But when we become trapped in a mimetic cycle, the world slips away and art becomes a self-referencing and barren activity. The crucial distinction becomes the one between derivative works on the one hand, and on the other hand, the works which reflect an effort to see, to comprehend, to be part of a unitary world. This becomes my answer to the question of high versus low in the arts. These designations don't matter very much. What matters is whether the work escapes mimetic loops and shows something deep about the world, the unified world in which we would belong. I've tried to give some rough account of what might be going on in picture taking, something about the character of its mimesis and about the arts in general. I spoke also about sensibility as a way of apprehending a unity in the world. I'd like briefly to look at a few images from one photographer who I think shows a particularly humane sensibility. And once we've looked at a few of these images, I'll conclude. So this photographer is Pentti Sammallahti. He's a Finnish photographer. And he was born in 1950. And let me put up the first image of his that I mean to show. This will just take me a moment. Let's see. Here we go. He took this picture in India in 1999. And you can see there's a little dog sleeping on a cow. I think this is probably a cow. In the dog, you see the tenderness of sleep, the vulnerability, and the dog is tiny. And the cow is occupied simply with being a cow. But you see, we're also in a human world in as much as there's a manhole cover and pavement and paving stones. So this is an image which to me brings together the elements of a world. And part of how it does so is in the aesthetic unity of the image. It's a beautiful composition. And the tones are beautiful. The hide of the cow almost glows, and you have that small figure of the dog atop it. So to me, this seems to be a good example of a vision of a world. This is a world in which the human and the animal realms have a relation, and that there's even relation among different kinds of animals. So it's it's a glimpse of a unified and coherent world in which there would be a place for beings of all kinds. So that's one image, and then I want to turn to another here. Let me bring up the next one. Let's see. Is that coming across? I don't think it is. Hang on. Are you seeing an image right now? Okay, good. This picture, Pentti Sammallahti took in Finland in 2002. And you can see you have this improbably placed broken branch. And two birds on the branch. The tree may be dead, but it's still part of this larger coherence of the winter scene and this profusion of twigs and branches. The birds seem to be endorsing the improbability in as much as they're occupying the branch. So you have a world in which the living and the dead and some of this, quiescent on a kind of winter, all holds together. And there's a visual unity. You have a lot of visual elements going on with all these trees and the fence and the building beyond. And yet compositionally, it's beautifully handled. Let me go on to a third image here. This image, Pentti Sammallahti took in, took in Estonia in 2004. You have power poles, power lines, some kind of transformer installation or something having to do with the power lines. And these birds have constructed nests atop the frontmost power pole and atop this little transformer shack, so that we see we see nature and the human world intermingled. In the background, toward the left, you have a smokestack visible. So there's a sort of the industrial elements, but they harmonize with these natural beings. And the birds have completely occupied this kind of industrial apparatus, so that not only do we have a nest at the very top of this front pole assembly, but there's a littler nest down below. So this too shows a kind of integration of elements, all of them again held together by an excellent composition. And I think these are all fairly representative of how Pentti Sammallahti goes about things. He tends to portray animals. In fact, many of his pictures are images involving dogs. And overall, I think he's a good exemplar of the effort to see a coherent, unified world through photography. So I'm going to conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you. Many of my comments will dovetail with what Mr. Carl and Mr. McDonald have said. My part in this is more personal. It's more of a personal reflection on my response to a single photograph, and I'll bring in other photographs on the way. But I'm just going to jump in and show you the photograph, if I can pull it up, and I hope everyone will be able to see it. Okay, now I have to find it. Hang on. So take a look at this. This photograph was taken in 1826 or 1827. It's the earliest photograph that we have. I don't say first photograph because I think there were a few attempts before that were not preserved for us. This is the earliest one that we have, and that still exists. It's made by a French inventor, Nicéphore Niepce. You see his name at the bottom, Niepce, and again, let's stress the date, 1826, 1827, and you just reflect on that. This is 1826, 1827. This is the year of 1826 was the last of the Mohicans. John Constable was at the prime of his career. This was about 30 years before Vincent van Gogh was born. Beethoven was writing his last quartets. Schubert wrote his Ninth Symphony. And Stendhal's Rouge et Noir was written a few years after this. So it's 1826, 1827. And it's what you see. It's a pewter plate on which has been smeared a kind of tar, it's called Judea, bitumen of Judea, which is a kind of asphalt. So it's a kind of tar, and then it's hardened, and then it's heated to get a shiny varnish, and then it's put in this contraption called the camera obscura, which is like a pinhole camera. If you imagine kind of homemade cameras that are pinhole cameras, it's put in the back of that. And artists used to use that to capture images and to draw the outlines of images. So camera obscura, this was put in the back of the camera obscura and then exposed to whatever image was coming through that tiny hole in the camera obscura. And it was there for about 8 hours, and then taken down, and then it was dipped in lavender oil to remove the tar that wasn't hardened, and then it was kind of put in some box where there were iodine crystals that then turned the negative image, which was what happened when the tar was removed, into a positive image, and this is what you get. So this is an image on pewter, and so obviously there's some. Can go a lot more into the chemistry. I mean, I can't, but we could at a subsequent date. But the how it is that somebody even thought of doing this, why did they think that something would come of it? And you can imagine the astonishment at the miracle of this image that appeared. It's a view from Niepce's window, apparently maybe his bedroom window, looking out. And when you look at the image, and it's you see buildings, you see trees, and kind of like the beautiful shadowy thing. The first time I ever saw this, I was very moved by the beauty of this, and found myself wondering why I didn't wish for this to be clearer. Why did I not want for more? Why did I think this was just perfect? Later on in the 1850s, it was cleaned up a little bit to get this pointilliste effect, and I don't like it as much as the original. Let me see if I can get back to the original. Okay, so here's the original image, and So I found myself reflecting quite a bit why I was so moved by it. The historical circumstances, yeah, those were moving, but the image itself seemed very beautiful. So thinking about Mr. McDonald's description of mimetic art, so well, did it move me because it's mimetic? Says no. There's something about the blurriness, the fadedness that I found deeply moving. And why? It was only later, when I was reading Japanese writers, that I realized that this response that I was having comes under the rubric of a term, yugen, which is an aesthetic term in Japanese, which means kind of dim, faded. And reading more, I realized, well, okay, that's precisely this spectral quality of something barely seen, something in between the world of vision and something else, right? It's as if it's an image, it's a lost world. You're seeing it from a great distance, it's as if you're looking at this image from the other side of something. I mean, clearly, obviously, it's literally the other side of a window, but it's like the other side of some divided perception when you're not seeing anymore what somebody would see if they stood at the real window. So then what does it evoke? Well, I don't know, a kind of sense of lostness. You know, the image itself, it's a trace. It's like what happens to fabric when you leave fabric out in the sun. You know, so if you leave fabric out in the sun and there's a patterned shadow, like a grill or something that's over it, then the a kind of patterned a patterned sunburn image will appear on the fabric, a kind of pattern fading. Same thing that happens with a sunburn. But so to some degree, a photograph has something similar to a sunburn or to any kind of action of the sun on material. But yet also this is a picture of some kind. Okay, so then what does it mean for it to be a picture? The distinctive way I think that this photograph, and maybe all photography is a picture, is that it captures a trace, a trace in material. And it's the trace of a moment in time, or a trace of, in this case, a section in time, an 8-hour exposure, right? But we think of it as catching something, catching an image. When we have a camera, we catch something with the camera. And to say that we're catching something, we're implying that this thing is fleeting, right? And so it's fleeting. It means it's now gone. You know, so after we've caught it, the original thing is now gone. So, but then this photo, I think, is also an image of catching. I think, you know, it's not only the thing, but it's also an image of catching. Somehow the catching is here. This is the trace, and so this sense of, just talk about you again a little bit. So just for lack of time, I'm not going to read what I was going to read, which was a section from the 14th century Japanese writer Kenko, in which in a book called Essays on Idleness, which we read in the Eastern Classics program in the summer. But in that, Kenko talks about the desire of most people, how most people want to see, right? They, you know, so if you're in a festival, I mean, and the participants in the festival are passing, most people kind of like jostle and they push and they jump and they stand on the tiptoes in order to see. And Kenko says, why is that? That's kind of strangely vulgar, because even when you're at the festival and you're there and your view is blocked by people in front, you know, you're just as much at the festival and experiencing the festival as everyone else, you know. So, but except it's not only by seeing. It's somehow vulgar to think that it only has to be by seeing. Similarly, Kenko would say that people might think of a flower as worth seeing when it's in full bloom, but why is that the only stage of the flower that is worth seeing? Why is it not equally worth seeing, say, as a bud or as a withered flower, as a withered petal? That the desire to see it in a kind of culmination in its full form is a kind of vulgarity to Kenko. The sensitive person would see that as a bud or as a withered form, the flower is much more vivid. The flower has more life because it's possibilities. It's all possibilities then. And Kenko then says, well, what person would say that a love relationship is only interesting at the moment of consummation? Right? That is pure vulgarity. The love relationship is interesting maybe before it started, when the two people meet for the first time and they don't know what's going on, or afterwards when they've broken up and they don't know what went on. You know, then it becomes interesting, and the person of sensitivity is kind of interested in that indirect view, the kind of like a veiled view of the relationship, which perhaps something like this photo shows. I'm going to find another photo. So let's see, this one here. This is a rather famous photo by photographer Edward Steichen. Steichen, I don't know how you pronounce it. You know, Steichen in German. You know, German photographer who became American. The Pool, right? And you see that this has got a similar kind of blurred, faded quality, but it captures something. It captures that sense of the wintry pool, the mud. I can smell mud in this. I can smell roots in this without having to see it, right? And so this dimness, the fadedness, opens the door to, I think, a very full participation with the whole of the rest of your being. It's not just eyes. This relates back to what Mr. McDonald was saying. I'm now going to give you a little gallery of some pictures that point to this. This one is by Czech photographer Edward Sudek. I find this exquisitely beautiful. Again, it's kind of it's blurry, unlike Mr. Carl's photos. There are no clear lines, right? So one characteristic is that there's no there are no very dramatic contrasts. It's all mainly grays, and this comes from the blurring. So it's the fadedness. But how poignant this is, this circle or this triangle of sheets, there you have family life, like all there in those sheets, the ritual, the weekly ritual, maybe the monthly ritual of family life, a whole way of being, hung around this line that, maybe is the habitual line of the family. Maybe this is seen through a window, maybe this is seen through a steamy window, but what an evocation of that. You don't have to show the beds, you don't have to show the people, but it's all here. This one is another one by Sudek, again seen through a window with moisture either inside or out, probably inside, condensation, and probably the moisture is inside because you wouldn't be hanging the laundry out on a wet day. So there you see sheets. Now they're in a straight line, and it's clear in both this one and the previous one, you can talk about the wonderful compositional elements. This is a wonderful composition, but this is kind of indirect, veiled evocation of life that feels as if, to me, as if I'm looking at it after it's long gone, which I am. I'm looking at it after it's long gone, and these people are not there. These people are dead. And the whole life has gone, but this is alive. Let's find another Sudek paint. That's not. Yeah, so this is Sudek dealing with people, and same thought. Some kind of festival, some kind of gathering, maybe a wedding, but faded. You find yourself peering in, right? What are these forms? There are no distinct lines. Even the shed, or whatever it is on the left, has got what appear to be straight lines, but even they are blurry. But there's something going on. There's something that you want to join in with. You want to go towards them. The lines of light, the light at the bottom seem to kind of draw me in, as well as the rays coming from the top. But what an image! I feel like, okay, something has gone. And here I am participating in it. Kanko would say, you don't have to see, you don't have to force your way to the front of this crowd. You don't have to make a panorama of what's happening. See, that would be vulgar. It would be pedantic to try to do that. So the Sudek, I'm making another couple of images here. So this is different vein. This is a Hungarian photographer from about 100 years ago, Martin Munkaci, and there's a motorcyclist. Whoop, I can't go back, hang on. My back arrow is hidden by the row of panelists, and I don't know how to get rid of that. So this is, okay, amazing and beautiful image. I don't need to see the whole motorcyclist. Somehow that he's managed to catch it with natural element, the element of water, already obscuring this, but even as he took this photograph, a second later it was gone, right? But he caught the moment. So the goneness of this, the ephemerality, the transience is all there, and also the motorcycle is gone, also the motorcyclist is gone. But here's this moment in which you don't see, right? You partly see, there's a motorcyclist there, it's a young man, but you don't really see that. Here's another one, a German photographer, Ilse Bing, horses jumping through fire. Right here, there's clarity in a lot of the background elements, but in the foreground, the main participants, you don't see, right? But you know they're horses, but you can also feel their fear, their terror, the kind of closeness, and the fire is very evident, but you catch how this image of the horse puts it somewhere between life and death, somewhere between being and non-being. And you feel the fear, so it's a very visceral image. A more pedantic photographer might show the fear in the horse's eyes, might show, you might want to show like more aspects of the horse afraid, but you don't need to. You don't need to see the horse. You know exactly what the horse is going through just from this. A few more images here. So this is okay. A great contemporary Japanese photographer, Hiroshi Sugimoto, who's more famous for seascapes. He's very famous for a series of evocative seascapes. He did a series of architecture in which he took blurred photos of buildings, kind of deliberately blurred. And, so again, okay, so what are you doing? So you're deliberately preventing clear seeing, right? So it's not about seeing anymore. So it's not mimetic in that simple sense. I'm not taking a postcard of the Eiffel Tower. I'm taking an obscured picture of the Eiffel Tower. I mean, no one's in any doubt that that's the Eiffel Tower. So Sugimoto said that he wanted to show like what the kind of integrity of the building, the strength of the building that remained after as much had been taken away from it as possible from this. So you see that there's the Eiffel Tower, but I also feel that it's also putting it somewhere between being and non-being, kind of like pushing it back from the foreground of existence into something where it's almost not being. It's on the verge of not being, and it's now become poignant for me. This thing might as well not be. Now this is very poignant, right? So here you have the World Trade Center, 1997, and so magnificent buildings, and the magnificence comes across. But also, even then in 1997, I think we sense the transience. We sense that now these are not solid. These will go, like everything else, and so that they're already on their way out. These are destined to go. One more here. This is a chapel in Notre Dame, where here again, the solid elements, as it were, being melted in light, right? So they're evaporating, or they're fudging into light and shadow. That's where there's in these last three, there's no more boundary between the object and between mere light and shadow, and so like they're being kind of reabsorbed again into something more, something more primal, and again, very, very, very poignant, very mysterious to me. This one fills me with a sense of mystery, which may be appropriate for the subject matter, and it would maybe convey it better than a photograph in which everything is perfectly focused. So just to go back to our first picture, so you see, I keep pressing the wrong arrow. So you see a family resemblance between all of these pictures that I think this one is the first ancestor to, so in a way, this one contains to me something of the essence of what a photograph is, namely a trace of something fleeting, something that you only half see, something that you don't see fully. And for me, this speaks very directly to my heart, because in thinking about life in general, you think, well, how much do we not see? back to what Mr. Carl was saying, like how much do we actually not see, or Mr. McDonald's, how much of the world actually isn't there for us? You know, so very often the most moving pictures to me are the more modern ones that may be poorly composed in the classical sense, but that catch some kind of movement, some kind of fleeting movement, an expression, and that's where like high and low art blur, right? You know, because sometimes the that catching of the fleeting, the sense of transience, the sense of possibly having missed my life, or having half missed my life, or not only half living in the world that I'm in and not seeing anything directly, like that I think is very much of the essence of photography. Okay, so one more thing about this. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that around the edges, you'll see traces of the pewter, you'll see traces of wear. And if I zoom in a little bit, you'll see that there's marks on this thing, right? You know, so traces of time, actually physical traces of time on this thing as an object. And that kind of connects with another principle of Japanese aesthetics, wabi sabi, which is translated as rust, which is the element of transience that's actually built into things. And sensitivity to life involves being sensitive to transience as it is built into things. You know, like I'm looking at this and I'm saying, look at this dents and scratches. Look at what this thing has gone through over 100 years. I have my dents and scratches that I've been beaten around. I've had things impact me and left marks on me. You know, so it's a funny way, I'm not immune to the same thing that this photo is immune to, transience leaves marks. And of course, in this one, I only see a representation of the object, but the fact that the marks are on the object, it's very moving to me still, because it reminds me of the objectness of things, which means a kind of vulnerability to time. Kenko again said that he said some people complain when a silk scroll is used to wrap a manuscript, and how delicate it is, and it shouldn't be, something as delicate shouldn't be used to wrap a scroll. And Kenko said that, well, actually, it's the delicacy that's important, because it's when that silk is a little bit frayed, when it's a little bit torn, when there's a mark, that's when it becomes beautiful. It's the mark of vulgarity to want everything like pristine and new, right? So this is the aesthetics of going to a used bookstore and buying an old battered book, rather than a big, you know, a shiny one that you can say that's your own. So the attraction to marks of time, I think, is part of this aesthetic that of fadedness, of dimness. Just in conclusion, I'll say that there's only one copy of this. You know, it can't be reproduced because it's on one plate, so you can't print things off this thing. And this photograph, which Nyaps called a heliograph, a sun drawing, was actually it's in Austin. It's in the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. So if you're in Austin or anywhere near, you could make a pilgrimage to that. And now I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you all. Just as we're transitioning to the question period, we'll take a couple-minute break. I haven't asked my panelists if I can do this, but I'm going to do this. Just want to call attention to some writing by our tutors today. Mr. McDonald in May published an opinion piece in the Albuquerque Journal that I just commend to our community, titled "The Best of the Human Enterprise Will Carry On," May 17th, 2020, about his and our experience after the March disruption. And I want to call attention to two books published by our other two panelists in 2018. Mr. Venkatesh published a book titled "Do You Know Who You Are? Reading the Buddha's Discourses." And Mr. Carl published a book, Letters on Aesthetics, Volume 2, Notes on Quality. There is a Volume 1. And I just thought it'd be worth mentioning some recent writing by our panelists. with that, let's take a 2-minute break, just a 2-3 minute break, and then we'll come back and get going with discussion. Okay. As we're transitioning back, we did get a couple of comments during the talk. Maybe 1 or 2 photos were not visible or were not immediately visible. And if that becomes relevant in the discussion, perhaps our panelists can pull them back up. So there are 3 ways you can offer a question or comment. One is using the Q&A function, and you'll write a comment, question or comment in. You can also do that in the chat box to the panelists. And you can raise your hand, and there's a button, or there should be a button visible to you at the bottom of your screen, and we'll see who in the audience has raised their hand, and we can turn on your microphone, and then we can ask if you'd like to be made visible to the. Sometimes I struggle with that a little bit. So I see a hand up. I think we'll start there, and we'll just try to be fair and cycle around. I'm confident that no matter how long we go, we won't get to every question. So just bear with us, and we might pick some and then pass over some that we think, we're more or less the same. So with that, and I'm just going to read the names as they appear here. John Carpenter has his hand up. I'm going to turn on your microphone. Are you there?
I am indeed here.
Would you like to make you visible, or do you just want to ask your question?
It's fine. You may make me visible if you wish.
Okay, let's see if I can do that after.
Yes.
John Carpenter, the movie director from The Thing, or is it a different John Carpenter?
Okay, you should be joining us, and then you may need to turn on your own video. This may seem tedious, but all things being equal, we'd like to see each other, and then I'll take you off after we've heard from you. And so please.
Okay. Mr. Venkatesh caught basically he described me perfectly when he said pedantic photographer, because many years ago I was atop Sky City at Acoma and shot a photograph of a pool atop city. And I happened to come home and I opened a book by Ansel Adams, and he photographed the exact photograph that I had photographed, and mine was so lifeless. And so, like you were saying, it was a photograph instead of a piece of art. And yet Ansel Adams was so much a beautiful piece of art, where mine was so photographic. And I guess what I was thinking was that it's like maybe a musician trying to compete with Rubinstein or something. I was trying to compete with Ansel Adams, but it's amazing how a photograph that is ostensibly the same photograph can be so different. And I would like the panel to comment on that concept, if you would.
By essentially the same photograph, you mean that as a document, the 2 photographs document the same thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This sounds closest to the topic, Mr. McDonald, that you were talking about. Do you want to take a first pass at that? The difference between the document and the art?
Yeah, I was, yeah. What's interesting is to what degree a particular way of seeing or a particular sensibility is carried in a particular image. And Ansel Adams has a very characteristic way of seeing, which is hard to emulate, even though many people have been heavily influenced by him. And And I think that being in the same place or seeing the same scene is in a funny kind of way only a small portion of what makes up a photograph, because there's so many decisions. I mean, I said that, you know, you're not having to struggle over brush strokes and these all these decisions about how to render something. But when you take a photograph, you are making a lot of decisions, very subtle decisions, in what kind of camera you're carrying, where you're standing, the precise quality of the composition, and then all the processing that might occur, whether you're thinking of film photography or digital photography. So I would at least say that the thing you're taking a picture of is one ingredient, and the rest of it is very hard to emulate. But to the degree that your rendering and his are both distinctive, that shows you know, the characteristic sensibility or way of seeing that each of you brought to it.
Does anyone else want to add to that, or Mr. Carpenter, did you want to?
I'll just say that one of the things I did when I started studying photography seriously is I started taking pictures myself. And unlike Mr. McDonald and Mr. Venkatesh, who have taken and shown me some very good photos, the photos I took were really bad. But I feel like I learned a lot trying to understand why were my photos not good. You might think, oh, it's just a picture of a fork in a bowl. Like anybody, right? The old anybody can do that argument, and that applies not only to photography, but many works of art. And in fact, learning to see why, in fact, anybody can't do it, what distinguishes a work where there's real depth and humanity, and the failed efforts on my part, I found extremely helpful for appreciating other photos.
I'm finding that the notion of mimetic is the thing that we need to think about, because as Mr. McDonald was saying, there are different senses of mimetic. I mean, one might be simply physically reproducing the visual elements that are in front of you on this sheet, right? You know, so then that would be kind of visual mimesis or replication of this, which would be very different from, say, what I was talking about. It's kind of like a trace. But then this deeper mimesis would be to reproduce the feeling of whatever the feeling is that this gives me at the time, right? You know, so okay, so that's interesting. So then the artist could think, well, okay, I got it, or I don't have it yet. You know, if I move a little bit, okay, no, I don't have it yet. I move a little, oh, I don't have it yet. I think in practice, artists don't think, oh, this is the feeling that I have. Now I'm trying to get it with this, you know, to have that kind of standard. So I wonder if there's another possibility, namely that it's not mimetic. Namely, this thing is trying to, you know, so that what the photographer does is trying to get something that's in them to get, but they don't know what it is. Right, you know, so they only know what it is when they've got it, you know. So then, okay, boom, that's it. Wow, I would have never thought of that yesterday, right? Boom, and that's Mr. Carl's fork and, you know, bowl, you know. So that boom, it's there, and this idea of the non-mimetic, I find it's very interesting to me, because I think when and I've brought this up in other contexts in other classes. So when you watch musicians at work, when they're playing something, the expressions that they have on their face are not expressions that you see in everyday life, right? You know, so whatever they're feeling through this, they're not. It's not an imitation of feelings that they've already had. I mean, it seems that as they're playing, something new is coming up that they're now feeling, and I think that most of the time with the great artists, what this new thing that they're feeling is not generic, right? And this is why, when talking about the emotional effect of art or of music, we can often sound really clunky, even idiotic, when we say, "Oh, Beethoven was sad in this part," and then it starts getting happy. I mean, it just sounds stupid because it's not, because feelings may not actually be generic like that, real feelings. So it's like, it's not an imitation of joy. I'm not trying to capture the joy I had of that celebration then. That's just not how art works. So in a way, I'm thinking that what a photographer as an artist does, they give themselves to whatever's in front of them in some way, and they give themselves to a way of relating to them with camera, until suddenly, boom, they got it. Here's this new thing. I don't know where this came from, but here it is, and it's perfect, right? And I think that's more like how it works. I don't think ultimately it's mimetic. There's the other sense of, okay, on the one hand, I'm also, it may be with a normal photographer, I'm trying to capture what I'm feeling at this moment, the joy of this occasion. But I think a deeper human being thinks further, oh, when I'm looking at this 30 years from now, what will I be feeling that it captured? Right? They'll be shot through with a kind of sadness. And then the act of photographing the moment becomes very different.
We have lots of questions and comments coming in. I wonder if we might move on to another one, and just thank you, Mr. Carpenter. I'm going to put you back in the audience. Thanks. We have one comment I'm going to read and just see if any of our panelists want to say anything in response. And this is from Tarkovsky. I love the way Mr. McDonald's view of photography as a way of recovering the world, and Mr. Venkatesh's view of photograph as a veiled evocation, as something that might indeed bring us to the recognition that we are missing our lives. I love the way both those things are true. Do either of you want to comment, or just let that hang in the air as we move on to another question?
Are you going to read Ms. Cowley's question next? Because I have an answer for Ms. Cowley, which is related to Mr. Tarkovsky's question, if that's the direction you're heading.
Is that good with the other panelists?
Mm-hmm.
We can come back to it, but it was a nice comment. Mm-hmm. From Jill Cowley, question: what draws you to photography as opposed to painting? Does it have to do with the discussion of mimesis, i.e. catching reality, and at the same time catching feeling/mood?
So I just wanted to mention, in relation to that question, I don't know if the audience is aware of this or not, but Mr. McDonald, Mr. Venkatesh, and I did not share our talks with each other beforehand, and I was really struck by the places of resonance and the way Krishnan in particular kind of opened by talking about the personal nature of photography. I think there's something intimate about photography because we can take pictures ourselves, or pictures can be taken of us, which makes for a kind of personal intimacy, which is what made me think of Mr. Tarkovsky's comment. He probably doesn't know this, but his namesake is a very powerful Russian, I'm sure he does know this, I'm joking, a powerful Russian director whose film Mirror is, to my mind, both an example of the comment he's making, but also a kind of relationship to photography and cinema in a deeply intimate and personal way. And I'll just note as an aside that my interest in photography came upon me late, unlike Mr. McDonald and maybe Mr. Venkatesh as well. I mentioned this in my talk. My first love was, and probably still is, books, literature, poetry, philosophy. And 10 or 12 years ago, I started studying film very intently because I was curious about how narrative unfolds in other medium in addition to the novel. I started out with a passion for the novel when I was a little kid, turned to cinema as a way of storytelling, and then came to photography because I realized you can't understand cinema deeply unless you understand the image. And to learn how to understand the image, I had to start with photography. So in a funny way, I'm working backwards from the novel to film to photography, but all of it is deeply connected for me. And painting is a part of that too. I don't think it's a preference for photography over painting, although I do think there's something more personal and intimate about photography than painting, especially in the world we live in today.
I was drawn to photography initially as a practitioner, and it was partly on account of having access to a lot of good photographs where I grew up, which was the same area where the Westons and Ansel Adams had lived. And so many of these prints were visible to me in, on the walls of galleries in the area where I was. And so I got to see a lot of these originals and be in the places where these photographers had worked. And for whatever reason, even prior to encountering those works, I found photography much more moving to me than painting. Maybe I simply hadn't been initiated into the tradition of painting, but when I started to want to do something myself, I seemed to be very poor at rendering through drawing. I didn't seem to have that pictorial ability, or I hadn't cultivated it, whereas I felt I could apprehend something important in what I saw and capture it with a camera. So I began as a practitioner, and then and I think now photography is interesting to me, both in practice, but also on account of its being an automated or very modern art. And so it brings up a lot, it raises a lot of interesting questions about the role of automation and technology in aesthetics, and connects to other interests I have. So so that's how I got there. And I should say too, it's hard not to love the craft of it if you get to do darkroom work, because it has this kind of industrial feel, but it's also very kind of it's got a certain kind of grimy imprecision, at least in as much as you're standing in darkness and trying to manipulate trays of liquid and floppy bits of wet paper and so on. So there's a kind of intrinsic appeal to that too for me.
Yeah, when we get back after COVID, when we get back to campus, I want to use the campus darkroom fully, because it happens to be right next to the campus chemistry labs. So all the supplies that we need are there to get messy and to duplicate some of the efforts of these early photographers. I myself, I started off with photography fairly late in life. I despised the act of walking around with a camera wherever I went, but I only ever saw people doing it in their, for purposes of documentation. But I convinced myself that I liked just having my naked eye, and I prefer to see rather than to make a product of what I saw. But it was, I think, only in my 40s that when I got a camera and I was traveling through India, that I then realized that I was seeing more because I had the camera. I was seeing differently because I had the camera. And then I discovered, again fairly late in life, that I'm not very verbal, really. That I don't think in words. I tend to think in images and sounds and things. And I happen to have become good at thinking in words, but that's still not me. So I needed a kind of antidote to the words, something where I could express. I couldn't do it in music because I started too late for my musical abilities to be expressive, and drawing and painting take a lot more time than I had. But the thing about the camera, especially with a phone, is that I have it with me all the time, and then there's a pleasure in being led by this. When it becomes part of the way you see. Because with every new phone I have, the camera is different, and I have to take different pictures because I can't do the same thing. So I'm then very curious about what does this phone enable me to see that the others didn't, and what and so I just following the lead of the equipment. So this goes along the lines of what the magic of the technology is that I'm fusing with this. I'm trying to become one with this thing, but letting it take me where it can take me, and just following it and letting myself be surprised.
Thank you all. We have more questions. We have a hand raised by Miss Mendizabal. I'd ask you to hang on for a second because we've had a question written for a while that I actually think might connect to the discussion of the dark room. So I'd like to go ahead and read this from Brett. With photography in general, and thinking of the Finnish, that is from Finland, photographer in particular, what does it matter if a photograph is altered or manipulated or a fake, in quotes? Is it no longer a photograph if there's some manipulation to it?
In the original rendering of the image, there's always manipulation in some sense. So I'm not sure whether Brett's asking about manipulation at those various stages from the initial exposure to producing a print or putting it on a screen, or whether Brett's asking about subsequent alterations of some image that the photographer regarded as finished. But I think this is part of what's really interesting about photography is there's necessary manipulation along the way. Certainly, if you're working with film technology, but also if you're taking digital photos, you are going to be doing some kind of processing, or your phone is going to be doing some kind of processing. The built-in manipulations that happen, for example, on an Android phone are significant. It's not simply presenting you with what the sensor received. It's not even clear what it would mean for it to do that. So the manipulation is intrinsic, and a lot of the art, I think, has to do with the judgment of what sorts of alterations you're going to make. How much contrast will there be? How will you crop the image? Is it a black and white image or a color image? What if it's black and white film? Which film are you using? What kind of paper will you print it on? What size will the print be? All of these things determine really what the work is. Will it be displayed on a video screen or on paper? So I can't envision an unmanipulated photo. That's not to say that it's manipulation in a bad sense. It's just part of the craft.
I wonder if the question is, this is something I've heard people say before about, say, Photoshop or digital manipulations is, oh, it's cheating, right? Like you didn't really take the picture, you made the picture. And my sense of that has as much to do with sort of broader ideas about art as about photography in particular. I remember I'm teaching the senior language class at the moment. We've been translating Baudelaire's poetry, and I remember commenting to my students a week or two ago that the one thing every artist has to do is make a choice. And what distinguishes really interesting art from uninteresting art is a good artist makes the right choices. So whether you're making that choice behind the camera or in front of the computer screen, my intuition is that you can't ever really cheat. If the choice is to add a tint or to crop, you're still choosing. And the uninteresting artist will not choose as interestingly as the interesting artist. Just like the interesting poet chooses the right word, and I seem to infallibly choose the wrong word.
I might, Mr. Venkatesh, I don't want to cut you off, but I don't want to insist that everybody speak to every question. So I might take Ms. Mendizabal's question now. Ms. Mendizabal, would you like to be made visible?
So, yeah, I think I should be able to join you.
Okay, I'll be making you a panelist. This will take a second.
Okay, there I am. Hi,
Nice
everyone.
to meet you. Welcome.
I don't really know what I'm asking. I sort of have a kind of nebulous bafflement about art, and I guess I'm going to call it math in general. And it's been sort of triggered by Mr. Venkatesh's, your awe for these ghosts that you were showing us. And this feeling that you were talking about of it being enough to not be there, and that the ghosts are enough, which is kind of ironic. And I think that's what you were pointing to But I think that's a feeling of like deliverance, and this is something that we try to do mathematically with our very like treasured like tools of precision and like calculus. Like for me, calculus feels like such a bizarre illusion that has been created to reach that ghost and to talk about that ghost. And I guess I'm just like really interested in how these extremes of aesthetics and logic, I guess, sort of mock one another, because art gives you the satisfaction that mathematization will never give us, and mathematization is infinite. So I was wondering if you could address that kind of speech between these realms that we dwell in. I hope that's, I don't know how clear that is.
I'm trying to remember it. Wasn't it Buchanan who wrote the book Poetry and Mathematics? Are you a Johnny?
Yeah, I'm a senior.
So if you, well, I was going to say go to the college library. You can't. Just Google or look wherever for Scott Buchanan's book Poetry and Mathematics. It won't answer the question you're asking, but I think it will deepen, not deepen, it will add new dimensions to what you're interested in.
Okay.
I'm just digesting what you're asking, because and there's a lot there, but I'm thinking, I mean, just personally. So personally, I think that there's sometimes a misunderstanding that art is about structure, right? You know, so that is when, say, music becomes all about structure, or when teaching a painting becomes all about perspective and the techniques of doing this or that. You know, so when it's about structure, then it becomes about techniques, and then it becomes kind of learning methods of doing this or that. And I'm thinking, say, Leonardo paintings, you know, for example, you have the, or Renaissance paintings, you tend to have all the perspective, the lines of perspective, and everything's very mathematically rigorous as it's trying to capture the scene and make it perspectively real. But then way in the background, there's the fuzzy castle on the hill, right? That the clouds in the hill, the stuff that doesn't get subsumed into the lines. And I always think that the real art is always there in the background. It's not in the fussing around with the structure, which tends to try to express, like, look how much prowess I have. Look at my technical skill, my ability in trying to get, you know, being able to capture, to seize, to comprehend reality. You know, so here's my comprehension of reality, and here it is. And I have the techniques to do it. I have the technology, and there it is. But an artist is always really aware of, like, what it is that lies outside that really defies that. And so that the fuzzy background, you know, the clouds in Renaissance painting, that can't be gotten by the technology. So I personally think that art is there in that, in those subtle vestiges of expression, and that when Mr. McDonald is talking about the education of the sensibility, and Mr. Carl about the education of the imagination, it's in a way to take us away from this, I think, very crude teaching of structure, kind of teaching of art as structure. It's also in when we're doing poetry at St. John's, you know, there are some people who get fixated on meter and on metrical questions and things. They get fixated on it because they think that's the entry into poetry, but it isn't, right? You know, so they get hung up on that, and so they never reach where the real art is, which is in that subtlety that perhaps only a person of sensibility can, you know, of cultivated sensibility can reach. right? And you hope you have some of those in your class, because otherwise you miss the poetry. That's just the beginning.
Right. Yeah, Mr. Carl brought up Baudelaire, which we are indeed doing, and that's certainly a very good example of the merging of this like wobbly, grotesque, the terror of what you cannot control, and then the meter is like beautiful in structure, and I guess I've been thinking about that. It's like, is he mocking the sort of like the body, the organic, by placing it into this structure? Or like, how do you talk about something that you can talk about? You know, I mean, we just did Hegel, and it's like, language is never going to be enough. You can't, you know, as exact as language is, the words just like come out, and they are no longer what you were doing and what you were thinking. And so with poetry, somehow you can actually kind of, I think, make things stay a little bit longer, and actually like a little bit longer, like for eternity. You get like that serene feeling of the orange, the old orange, and like we did in the first poem, and it's just really vivid and it's exact, but it's also like a combination of the mediums, and that kind of culmination of the two is, I guess, what will be recognized as the genius when they find a way to come together. But I also, I mean, somebody brought up in the lecture too that you can have sort of serendipitous works of art that haven't been planned and schemed, and there is perfection and there is an exact message there. And I don't know, I guess I'm just gonna keep rambling here, but the communication between exact and inexact, I guess, is what I'm wanting to talk about, to think about right now. The fuzzy and the not fuzzy, the clear, and how they revive one another.
Thank you. I don't, maybe,
Yeah,
maybe
I'll just
just
email someone. Yeah, thanks for the
to it.
book recommendation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, just one quick response. It seems that the speed of pressing the button on the camera, right? That click seems to be something that bypasses the obsession with structure, right? Because it doesn't, because I'm not laboriously making this image from scratch. So I'm thinking, you know, the parallel in literature would be 17th century Japanese haiku, where you have these 3-line things, they're masterful poems, but because they're only 3 lines, you can't spend a lot of time just fussing about it. There's something about the spontaneity that is crucial to this. You know, not saying that everyone who does it has to be spontaneous, but it seems to be inbuilt into the act of pressing the button. So then it becomes, one thing I like about it is it becomes more an act of pure expression, you know, about as close to get, you know, so this is pure expression, because I'm fussing with it as little as possible. If it were painting, I'd spend days on it.
Thank you. Ms. Mendizabal, we might return you to the audience. Thank you very much for the questions. And we'll take another question from Joshua Goldberg. I was taken by Mr. Venkatesh's presentation, which gave me a new appreciation for photography with extreme soft focus or lack of focus. My struggle with this form of photography has been that the early photographs had this quality largely as a product of the technological limitations of the era. More modern photographs that exhibit the same quality has therefore felt as if it is pretending to be from a bygone era. Your talk has convinced me that there is value and meaning in this type of work, but I wonder if you could speak to what extent the evocation of early photography and the time in which it developed adds to the aesthetics and feeling of these more modern works.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that. I'll have to think about that a lot more, I think. Partly because I don't, I'm not very learned in photography. I just happen to know a few photographs, and so I just need let me sit on that, and maybe the subsequent time we can correspond about that. But it's a good question. Thank you.
I could offer just the beginning of something, which is to say, a lot of early photography was either because of technical limitations or because of the prominence of painting as a visual art, was what ended up emulating painting. And then there was this reaction against that, and Ansel Adams was part of this, toward taking advantage of the intrinsic nature of photography as a clear medium, as better lenses and better film were developed. In the 20th century, there was the opportunity to bring a kind of crispness to the rendering, which hadn't been possible before, and even when it became possible, wasn't being practiced because people wanted to have photographs that emulated paintings. So there was that movement toward crispness and clarity. I think what's happening now with cell phone photography is some opportunity to return to a more limited kind of picture taking. It's actually one of the virtues of walking around with your phone, is there you are, usually without a choice of lenses. The image quality you can produce is limited. And that's actually, that can spur you toward different ways of seeing. So I don't know how to encompass your question or really address it fully, but I do think that some of the low fidelity mechanisms available even now, like through an older cell phone, or through these plastic cameras that are, deliberately have poor optics, those are actually good creative possibilities.
And I would say there's an interesting parallel in the question between photography and film. I think of a director like Canadian director Guy Maddin, who deliberately makes films through sepia filters and creates this very old look. But it's not purely nostalgic. It has a real powerful aesthetic value. It's not, for example, some of you may remember in 2011, that Hollywood film, The Artist, came out, which was a black and white silent film. And that was pure nostalgia. It's like, hey, remember? Of course, the audiences in 2011 didn't remember, but that might have been the first silent film they'd seen. And it was really just kind of a cheap knockoff of a great Chaplin film. Compared to that, what an artist like Guy Maddin is doing is not just trading on a kind of historic feature. He's using older aesthetic techniques to new ends. And I think it has a very compelling force to it.
We do not have a question queued up right now. I'll read a comment that we passed over. Goes back to the very first question in relation to Ansel Adams, and Peter below just commented that Adams spent hours on the scene waiting for the thing to appear.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, that brings us back to to one of those early questions about trying to. I mean, taking a picture at the same place where Adams took a picture and finding it's very much not the same picture. That there's something about the precise moment when you're taking a photograph that is irreproducible. And if you miss the moment or you try to come back and repeat the moment, it's impossible. And so a lot has to do with taking the picture at the opportune time. And yeah, photographers do sort of loiter waiting for that perfect moment.
Yeah, I know that seeing Mr. McDonald's photographs and the experience of my own, sometimes you might pass the same thing, like the same tree 100 times, knowing that's the perfect tree to photograph, but it's not right yet. And then one time you pass it and it's right, and then you take the photograph.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I see we have more questions coming in. I'm going to read the next question. Then I've got to step away for a minute or two, and Mr. Carl will deftly field further questions. And I should also say that we try to be merciful on our lecturers and panelists, and at whatever point you all want to tap out, but I think you've got a little more in you. So, Allison Chapman, Oscar Wilde said that there was no fog in London until the Impressionists put it there, and that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. I take this to mean that art creates the world we see, which would otherwise be invisible to us, thanks to the powers of habit and inattention. As an art that is composed of worldly materials and often of commonplace everyday objects, is photography perhaps uniquely able to create the world we see and inhabit?
I had this precisely in mind, in this kind of notion in my talk, that that how we see the world through photography and our photographic practice, which pretty much all of us are involved in some way, does condition our experience, and that's part of why it's a problem. If we get into a mode of relation to image making that's strictly derivative, is then our experience becomes impoverished, and why I would want each of us to do what we can to develop a broader way of seeing is so that we can have a richer experience. So yeah, I agree with the way Ms. Chapman is seeing it.
We're also drowning in images, and we don't realize, so drowning in an ocean of images, of photographs actually, that makes us insensible, so just so they go by so quickly, and so that's another way we lose the world, that because we become insensible through too much exposure, and which is why I think that conversations like this actually are very helpful in making us dwell on certain images and finding words for our experience. And it would be good if more people did this more often, because I think it's that slowing down and paying attention that's what does it, not the image itself.
I don't have anything to add to that, except for I want to just comment to Ms. Chapman that I've been telling that anecdote to my students for years, and so I hope you'll email me and share with me the source. I always thought it was in the essay Dialogue, Decay of Lying, and I haven't been able to find it there. And my distorted memory thought it wasn't the Impressionists, but it was Charles Dickens. And in particular, if you go back and reread the opening paragraph of Bleak House, there's this amazing description of fog and these dinosaurs like moving through the mud of London. And so I'd like to pin down the actual facts behind this anecdote, which I so wildly and irresponsibly foist on students. But I do think it's true that art, this is what I was saying about the fork, right? Art allows us to see things we've just grown numb to, whether it's always been foggy in London, but no one ever noticed until whoever it was, Charles Dickinson or the Impressionists. But so Mr. Sterling had to bounce to an uninteresting administrative meeting, and he's asked me to take over reading the questions. I'm just going to go in order. And the next one by an anonymous attendee is, what are your opinions on Instagram? I think I should let my colleagues answer that, because I have no opinion about anything that has anything to do with any form of social media, except for it's an unmitigated source of horror and evil in the world, and everyone who's responsible for inflicting it on us should be lined up against the wall and shot. That's not a politically correct opinion, I'll give it to Mr. McDonald instead.
Yeah, let me, I want to share my screen and show what I'm looking at right now on Instagram. So hopefully you're seeing this. It's a compositing of a bunch of images. Do you see that? So this is an account on Instagram called Insta Repeat, and what it does is it puts together these motifs, these recurring imitative images where Instagram is imitating itself. People posting on Instagram are posting things which are very much in a certain imitative line. And so let's see, here's another one. Those are feet viewed through the back of a vehicle. Auto mirrors, solitary person on beach, car with headlights, waterfall in wilderness. So one of the things that Instagram does is it fosters this kind of imitative image making, where you post an image because it's part of a because it somehow presents a received way of experiencing the world, and you want to show that you are part of that that received or accepted way of seeing. So now there are lots of ways of experiencing Instagram. So not every person using Instagram is doing that kind of thing of just posting stuff that's part of this kind of mimetic loop. But I think the general tendency of Instagram is not so good in its influence on the way people see the world. When you are out in the wilderness, if you are thinking about what you can take a picture of in order to post on Instagram, in order to represent your experience as conforming to the proper way of being in the wilderness as represented by other people in the wilderness, then your experience is, or there's a kind of alienation already present in your experience. Now, on the other hand, there are accounts on Instagram that are posting great photographs, either are the ones that are being taken currently by people who happen to like to post on Instagram, or older photographs that are being represented. And that's what I mostly do on Instagram, is I'm following either accounts which post old stuff, or mostly black and white picture takers who are working now and like putting their stuff there. But I think for many users of Instagram, it's actually narrowing their way of seeing, and it's making their experience less rich than it could be.
I will say as a footnote to my earlier comment that I was just talking about Instagram with my seniors today, and they were telling me that they've seen such wonderful photos taken by Mr. Venkatesh on Instagram. So clearly there's a place for it. I mean, not in my life, but in other people's lives. This next question, I think, is directed toward you, Mr. Venkatesh. It might be related to the Instagram question. It says, I'm very interested that all the panelists selected black and white photographs, particularly striking to me in terms of thinking about the light and color saturated photos that I associate with Mr. Venkatesh's work. Are there color photographs that capture you in the same way, or is there something particular in black and white that moves you?
Yeah, I mean, I love color, and my my own photographs, I think, would be considered vulgar in relation to the kind of aesthetic that I express, kind of like brash and aggressive. And but there's something, color expresses something different. There are color photographers that I like, and yeah, but it was too complex to bring this into this discussion. It was just yet another element. The philosopher Stanley Cavell wrote a wonderful book called The World Viewed, which is on cinema, and I strongly recommend that book. But one of the things he points out is that black and white tends to have connotations of or express reality, because black and white can do depth, and color, because color on film is mainly comes across as planes of color, is good for fantasy, right? You know, so for me, color is about fantasy, a kind of a rich emotional world that gets expressed there. You know, so how that relates to the kind of Yugen type photograph that's trying to get at emotional realities, I'm not quite so sure, except that with that kind of Japanese aesthetic, the sense of fading and of subtlety, you know, of saying by not saying, of showing by not showing, that's kind of tremendously powerful, and it has a tactful relationship to the viewer that maybe a color photograph doesn't have. That's my initial thoughts on it. I love both black and white and color.
I don't know how to see it in color myself, because I habituated myself, at least with regard to picture taking, to envisioning the image in black and white. And to the extent that I've tried to take color photographs, I've found it very difficult. I think black and white's the easier medium because, for example, compositional elements stand out much more easily in black and white. It takes, I think it's a different way of seeing to do color photographs, and one that I don't seem to have any access to, for whatever that's worth. I really think they're different. They're much different ways of seeing, and you know, so I've mentioned the Weston several times. Edward Weston was the father, and his son Brett went on in black and white photography, but Cole Weston went into color work. And Cole Weston has a few good color photographs, but you can tell he's challenged by the medium. It's a different way of seeing, and it's not really, he doesn't have any way of sort of picking up with the work that the rest of the family is doing. He would have to be a pioneer in his own right. In any case, I think they're really different genres.
Let's see. Don't see a current question, but I see, oh, no, there's a question. I have a question about the problems of multiplication related to the photography and energetics, and perhaps by extension, the ease with which digital media is formed and created, archived, and demands digestion, and yet constantly begs for our time to process it with real-time reality. It strikes me that the attention required to sift through this material is constantly competing with our collective and individual attention. And I'm wondering if the panelists consider this type of ethical dilemma that portends in terms of consumption of time. I don't know if this will speak directly to that question, but one of the reasons why, for me, the question of aesthetic quality has become so important, and it's really that. Like, is this a good book? Is this a good painting? Is this a good movie? Is unlike the world when I was the age of my students today, if I wanted to watch a movie, I had like 3 choices. If I wanted to watch a TV show, there was like 3 channels. If I wanted to listen to music, there were 2 or 3 radio stations. I had a very limited opportunities. I was limited to the books that were in the Eugene Public Library, and if they weren't there, I couldn't read them. With things like streaming movies, Spotify, you could listen to virtually any musical artist who's ever put out an album, and it is wonderful, but also overwhelming. So the pressure to be able to distinguish what is, quote, worth our time, however we want to define the notion of worth, is huge. I subscribe to the Criterion Channel, which is, I think, the best one-place streaming source for really great movies. And when I open that channel, I'm confronted with literally hundreds of great movies. Yeah. Which one am I going to watch?
Yeah. And do you find that numbing, the abundance of possibilities?
I find it invigorating and terrifying and overwhelming. Yeah. Because I've spent my whole life trying to read books, all the books worth reading, which is no one would ever succeed at.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then when you add all the other art forms I care about, and I wish desperately, like, I want to listen to the music of this incredible musical artist. I want to watch these great movies. There isn't time. Mm-hmm. So I find myself thinking, well, how do I distinguish? Like, I'm very confident when it comes to a book. If I read 30 or 40 pages of a book after 50 years of working hard to read, I can usually trust my judgment. Mm-hmm. With films, I feel like I'm getting better. With photography, I don't yet trust my judgment. But on the other hand, I think it's a real question, and maybe it's related to the question that has just been asked. Yeah. How long does it take to look at a photo? Like, when we did the study group last year, which spawned this panel, we would look at 2 or 3 photos over the course of about an hour and a half. I think we met for an hour and a half and would look and talk about 2 or 3 images. So is that enough time?
Yeah.
If it's a great photo, not. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn on my light. I realize I'm getting dark.
I'm seeing also there's a question from an anonymous person saying, how can I stop drowning in images? As you've said, there are so many images in today's world. How are human souls affected by this? So that's kind of a question in the same line. It does seem clear that images have special power because the primary mode of knowing for human beings seems to be visual, and so what we see will have an authority that what reaches us through other senses will not. And I have to say, part of how I respond to the abundance is by doing a kind of by cultivating a certain kind of indifference and limiting the amount of things that I encounter. So I don't subscribe to movie services that have a lot of good movies. It would just be too daunting. but I look at Netflix and I think, well, most of this is trash. There's nothing to watch. And that's a very strange position to be in, versus what you described, Mr. Carl, of growing up pre-internet and there were so few things available. But I seem to remember, and I hope I don't just sound like a nostalgist here, I seem to remember it being easier to find something that seemed richly engaging back when there were fewer things to be found. And currently, when there's such an abundance, I personally find it numbing, and so I just I try to avoid the abundance because it's just too much for me. Maybe that's a cop out.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the peril of Instagram, right? I follow a few photographers on Instagram. Some of them are friends of mine, and I enjoy watching their work. But it's a stream, and I often wonder about the dangers of succumbing to a kind of addiction to mental stimulation of a certain kind. I mean, this is true with reading too. When again, I've spoken about this before, is when you're compulsively reading, so you can't even eat your meal without reading the food box, or you can't even go to the bathroom without reading something. That's when you've become an addict or a victim. It's not about the quality, the experience of the photograph. It's about a compulsive need for more food to be shoveled in you, right? So it's essentially like fast food. But I think the thing about Spotify, streaming services, the whole binge watching phenomenon, is that it's all set up to make you a consumer. That everything is made to get you to buy something or to make money for someone else. But this means increasing your susceptibility, making you more susceptible to this flow without which they can't make money. And so when you become aware of that, there's a point when the more you think about it, there's a moment of disgust with this, and you want to break free. And I think the way is to not to worry about missing something. You're going to miss something no matter what you do. So, for example, when you go to an art museum, when I go to an art museum, I'll spend an hour on one painting or two paintings. I'll sit in front and I'll give myself to the painting, and then I'll leave. I don't have to go see the whole art museum. Right. And so it's like saying I'm full. I don't need it anymore. I'm full, right? And so when you slow down like that, you start to see more in what you're seeing, and that's what fills you. Not the quantity of things seen, but seeing more in what you're seeing. I mean, I think it's I describe it as a HD seeing. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And rejecting the consumption model at the outset.
Yeah. So then it doesn't matter what you're missing. The thing about consumer society is that it always makes you think you're missing something. But the antidote is to think that if what you're doing is good, mm-hmm. don't worry about what else that's good that you might be missing.
Yeah, right.
There's only time for this good thing here. So the whole life becomes filled with good things. Sure, there's an infinitude of good things that you could be doing. Yeah. But why worry about it? Mm-hmm. Because what you have is good, and it's got everything. Like the more you immerse yourself in what you have in the good thing, the more you see in it. You don't need more.
Yeah.
I would say this is one of the wonderful things one of the things I have learned from being a tutor at St. John's is you get a lot more out of spending an entire class talking about one or two stanzas of a Baudelaire poem than reading 8 poems for class and just skating over the surface of them. 8 poems is not more. It's significantly less than 1 poem, maybe even just part of a poem.
Yeah.
I see we have a hand up. Mr. Cray, Mr. Sterling gave me the ability to allow you to talk but not share your image. So we're going to have to look at the photo of you with your Mack truck. But can we hear you if you unmute yourself? You have to unmute.
Oh, yes. Yes. Hello. How are you?
Good. Thanks
Can you hear me?
I can't activate the camera, but we can hear you.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yeah.
No, you don't need to see me. I'm in the dark anyways on my bicycle. But yeah, I asked that question earlier about multiplication, and I raised my hand. So I guess I get a follow-up, which is kind of convenient. But what I agree about an individual strategy about how to manage the deluge of information and media. But I guess I feel like I'm actually also wondering about the societal implications, especially with regards to how it feels like it's been starting to tear at the fabric of us as a society. And it feels like there's beginning to become more of an ethical conundrum about how much information one can consume responsibly and what that does to our networks.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I guess, why I was talking about how it consumes our time
Yeah.
to kind of have to go through and process all this information.
Right. Yeah. I totally concur with that observation.
And I'll just add to that, a lot of my thinking about aesthetics, and I was probably in my talk being deliberately incendiary and comparing it to other forms of, inferior philosophy, which is not something I necessarily believe, but I do believe what the German philosopher Wittgenstein says in several places, that ethics and aesthetics are basically the same activity. And what you're pointing out about the societal implications shows what the social, political, and ethical stakes of aesthetic thinking are. And I think that's true. If we become desensitized or overwhelmed with images, which is a form of being desensitized, I think there are social, political, ethical implications to that. I might not go so far as to believe with Schiller that the path of beauty will make us politically free. I find it an engaging idea, but I don't think it's literally true. But I do think that the dangers of manipulation, control, and numbing are really extreme. We learn this from Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. Like, wow, watch out for what images can do. Incredibly powerful. I think we have one last question, if you two gentlemen are willing to field it, because I've already admitted to my complete ineptitude behind the camera. Mr. Rodriguez asks, how do you find your own voice or your own style as a photographer? I think that would be a nice question to end on this evening.
Yeah. I can start on that. I think it's important to become infatuated with particular photographers you admire. And I had sort of, criticized the tendency toward derivativeness. But here, what you're imitating is not the particular look of their images. You're trying to inhabit their sensibility. You're trying to step into their way of seeing, so we can learn from it and make images that allow you to take on some of the quality of their way of seeing. I think that's a kind of apprenticeship that one must go through. And so my own experience has been to become obsessive about a particular photographer, and I am under their influence for a while, and they influence what I do as a photographer. But the images I make may not even look like theirs, but something of their way of experiencing the world rubs off on me. And I think that's how you discover your distinctive way of seeing. I think also you have to try to see, well, what's my most primary mode of experience. So when I'm just out there among people or in the wilderness or seeing the things I see, what there is quintessential to my own particular complexion of emotion and intellect, and to what extent can I recognize that distinctiveness in the visual world and render it for others. But I think apprenticeship is really important, and it's something that's neglected. I think a lot of Instagram would be better, or maybe I should say, A lot of contemporary picture taking would be better if more people were willing to try to learn what the tradition is and see who's done what and what's worth emulating.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I remember when the novelist William Kowalski talked last year. There was one question in the audience. A young man asked, said that, well, I love Nabokov, and I'm worried about being too influenced by Nabokov. What do you recommend? And you know, at that point, I was thinking to myself, the solution really is to read all of Nabokov, because then you realize that he wasn't born Nabokov. You know, so you see the twists and turns of his career. You'll see how his voice emerged and that it changed. You know, so as with authors, you know, I'd say read whole authors, read all of them, you know, and there'll be a handful you'll be able to read at this time. Reading only great books, I think, can be very harmful, right? But similarly with you need to apprentice yourself. You need to see a photographer whole, right? But there's also another piece of advice that I've heard that was very good. So Guy de Maupassant, the French writer, was a student of Gustave Flaubert's, and in one of his novels, Pierre et Jean, Maupassant wrote an introduction in which he described what he had learned from Flaubert. And he said that Flaubert told him, and Flaubert is a very great writer, right? So Flaubert told Maupassant that when you're describing a fire, sit in front of the fire and look at the fire until at some point it becomes like no other fire. When you're looking at the tree, you know, so look at the tree until at some point. This could take hours, this could take days, it could take months, until you see the tree as itself. It's like no other tree. So then you're ready to write. And then he says, that's how you become original. And I think if you reflect on that, say if you think about writing an essay, a seminar essay, if you read the book twice, you'll only have generic thoughts. If you read the book 10 times, you'll start to have ideas that you can be fairly sure that no one else has had, and no questions have had. You'll notice things. If you read it 20 times, you know, stuff is going to come out, you know, that you never expected that you had. So I'd say that the sit and watch, sit with it, give it time, and then you'll become original. I think there's no shortcut to those two methods. You know, the apprenticeship teaches you what's possible, right? And opens your eyes. You know, without the apprenticeship, you would never know, you know, it would be a slow, hard route. You'd never find out all the things that are possible. But then to become original yourself, I just think you need to slow and sit and look.
So we've had a spate of questions, but more than we can possibly get to. So I've just put my email address in the chat, although you could find it through the college website as well. So for example, Mr. Ross had asked to talk more about ethics and aesthetics, and Mr. Ross, that's a conversation I'd be happy to have with you over email. Someone else, I think, asked about particular books. No, Mr. Goldberg. I did a ton of reading because that's what tutors do. When I was getting ready for the study group last year, I would be happy to share the bibliography or particular works. One I'll single out in particular that has meant a lot to me personally is Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida. It's a really beautiful poetic reflection on what poetry means to him personally. But gentlemen, would you like to make any final comments before we go have a belated dinner and walk my dogs?
No, good. Feel free to email us or follow up with questions in any way on Instagram even.
Yeah, message us on Instagram.
You won't find me there, but I'm happy to communicate with words. So thank you everyone for attending, and
yeah, thank you.
See you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Krishnan.
Okay, thank you both of you.
Everyone.
Bye.